Hello, and welcome to the Feet on the Soil podcast, the podcast about the world beneath our feet and how we interact with it. Well, if you're one of my Irish listeners, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, but this has been one of the best starts to a spring that I can remember. April has come along, and with it has come cloudless skies and the sun beating down. I went on a walk today, and I felt like I was in the middle of July or something. It's just such an absolutely gorgeous day that it felt like a crime to sit inside, so I put off recording the podcast, I'll admit that, but I'm doing it now, here when it's a little bit cooler outside. During this walk though, I found myself in a small wet woodland that I like to visit quite often. You've probably seen the TikTok I did about it, and explaining how wild spaces like that are so important. And while I was there, I was thinking about kind of forestry and how important it can be, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the topic of today's podcast. Today we'll be discussing the history of Irish forests and forestry. It's not exactly a story with a happy ending. To be honest, it's not a story with a happy middle either, but it's something that's very important to understand where we are now and what we have to do next. Ireland's colonial past holds a lot of significance in all environmental talks, whether it's the wolf, forestry, whether it's our wetlands, our peatlands. Pretty much everything within the Irish landscape was at one point a resource for other people's use. But as we'll get into in the episode, that doesn't mean that we just give up hope and forget about our forestry, forget about our peatlands. We've had independence for over 100 years, and in that time, things aren't that much better. For an island known as the Emerald Isle that prides itself on natural beauty, our forests aren't exactly what you would call beautiful at the moment. But of course this can change, and hopefully will change in the future. On a slightly different topic, today with the beautiful weather I also took a wander down to the Feet on the Soil Wildlife Reserve, and things are absolutely exploding. The warmth and sunlight have got the damson tree nearly like a cloud. It's just covered in little white flowers. The speedwell that's on the ground is holding itself for now, but as the grass grows and kind of floods it out, it's starting to die back. This isn't a bad thing. The pollinators have gotten their feed off it, and eventually that will give way to some nice grasses and stuff for habitat for different creatures. The other thing that I just can't get over is the amount of insect life. That area was just lawn, and it was kept quite trim. My dad enjoys going out with the mower, and usually you would wander down to the back of the garden and there wouldn't be that much. You might get the odd bumblebee going into the flowers of the damson or the hedge behind, but the actual ground itself would never have that much activity. That's completely changed in the space of 3 months. There's so much going on. Spiders, hoverflies, woodlice, the bees, honeybees, bumblebees, all types. It's been really magic to watch, and while researching this episode, of course, you get a little bit negative looking at the beautiful nature that we once had and the state that we now find ourselves in. But with projects like this tiny little thing at the bottom of my garden, and then also bigger scale things like what's going on with wild acres or what's going on with the Irish Atlantic rainforest that Owen Dalton is doing, these things give a lot of hope, and it's incredible how quickly things can recover. And with all of that out of the way, we'll get into our topic of the day: the history of Irish forests and forestry. You know in your head and heart what a forest is. As you walk around, the soft rustling of leaves, the buzz of insects, the song of birds in your ears, and the smell that is nothing but green, you know that you are in a forest. We all know what a forest is. A large stand of trees. Some of us may know of its different layers: the canopy, the understory, and the ground cover. And even fewer still may know that not all forests are made equal. The forests of historic Ireland would have been completely native forests, with beautiful oaks, birch, juniper, elder, hazel, alder, ash, all sorts of different native trees growing together, filled with biodiversity. The forests that a lot of people think of now for their weekend hikes or rambles are very, very different. Regimented lines of non-native Sitka spruce, put there more as a factory than a forest. These excuses for forests give no benefit to biodiversity. Nothing lives there, and you can feel that when you walk around. They almost feel creepy, like something from the Blair Witch Project. The straight man-made lines of trees make you feel uneasy, and the lack of any sort of life other than maybe the odd bird, everything about it just feels unnatural. Compare this to the feeling of walking in an ancient woodland. While these are few and far between, most counties will have one, and you should make it your mission to get out to one if you haven't yet. As you walk around one of these, everything is alive. You might get some bugs in your mouth, eyes and nose, but it's worth it for the views that you get. Trees grow in gnarled, random positions, and everything just feels like it should be there. Being in one of these spaces, you can tell it's no wonder that these were spiritual and revered places in the past. But in modern times, by many factors, they have become increasingly industrialized and turned into merely a resource prime for extraction. But what changed? How did we get from around 80% peak forestry cover all the way down to 1% at its very lowest? How did we stop treating forests as the lungs of the earth, these incredibly important and spiritual places, and start turning them into either a tourist attraction or just a timber factory? Well, like many things, it's a very storied history with a lot of parties, a lot of consequences, and a lot of very amazing stories. But in my research, I have tried to cover as many of these factors as possible, although I may have left out certain elements. But what we have here is a kind of general picture of the history of Irish forestry, and we will start with pre-human. If we were to transport ourselves back 12,000 years ago to the island of Ireland, there'd be very little forestry to talk about. In fact, all of Ireland was an ice sheet. Much like Antarctica, it was glacial and it was cold. There was no parent material for any sort of tree to grow on or any sort of plant. And so it was only after this ice began to retreat, about 10,000 years ago, that we see the first signs of Irish forestry. For the first few years, Ireland would have more closely resembled Iceland or Alaska, a cold tundra with very little plant life. But as this area began to warm up, pioneer trees began to arrive. Things like juniper, willow, and birch began to colonize the island. Through repeated dying, rotting down, and enriching of the soil, more trees began to appear, the likes of our oak and our larger trees. And at its peak, shortly after the retreat of the ice, up to 80% of Ireland's land was covered by native woodland, with the remainder mostly consisting of open highlands, lakes, and areas that were quickly becoming peatlands. The trees made it to Ireland through the existing land bridge between ourselves, the UK, and further onto the continent of Europe. Of course, this was all pre-human, and we can only imagine the haven for wildlife this would have produced. An island without any interruption from man. There was a completely different habitat and ecosystem there. Instead of the footsteps of man, we would have seen brown bears, giant deer, and wolves traversing the land and the forests upon it. Forests would have naturally regenerated and been able to live for hundreds, if not thousands of years uninterrupted, and so the biodiversity of all types in here, whether that be fauna, flora, bryophytes, everything would have been so biodiverse that we probably can't even imagine it. It's no wonder to think why, when humans landed on this land, it was a place of magic. It was a place of fairy tales and folklore before fairy tales and folklore were even a thing. The land would have been primeval and wild. And that brings us to the arrival of first man. Now, this is the first section that we get to where things get a little bit more complicated. It was widely believed for a long time that humans first landed in Ireland about 10,000 years ago, so towards that warmer stage of the Ice Age. But recent findings have pushed that occupation back to over 30,000 years ago. Now, with that in mind, the image I just painted of a wild, untouched land by man doesn't seem to ring true. But what I'm going with here is the more widely accessible information that is around humans coming 10,000 years ago. Humans would have arrived slowly over time, coming across that aforementioned land bridge from the UK, meaning that the east of the island was first colonised, and far later the west and north. The forest would have been incredibly important to these first humans, giving them shelter, fuel, food, and everything that one could need from the land. These Mesolithic hunter-gatherers would have understood the land a lot more than us, their modern counterparts, as they interacted with it every day. The forest would have become more familiar, but would have still been a place of danger, with animals like I mentioned, bears and wolves, ranging through the forests that they too hunted in. Not much is known about the Mesolithic people and their association with nature, but what we do know is that they were incredibly in tune with the wild. They knew when food was going to be coming around. They knew the spawning times of fish. They knew the fruiting times of different berries and the like. And this was, of course, crucial information. These people completely depended on the land. There was nothing else that was going to get them through a tough winter or a very warm summer. And with the majority of Ireland being under tree cover, we know that to them, the forest was everything. But what if you wanted to make life a little bit easier? What if you wanted to have a little bit more control over nature and not depend on it? Here we see the transition to Neolithic and farming practices within Ireland, and what can really be seen as the first time that we began to take away from the forests. As the new science of agriculture began to take over in Ireland, areas of forestry were cleared for livestock to accommodate expanding populations and increasingly centralized populations. Where the Mesolithic people roamed through the forests and set up temporary accommodations, Neolithic people created more permanent dwellings, and with this they brought their domesticated animals like cows, pigs and sheep, and different crops as well. To allow for this, forestry was cut down and clearings created. While of course the population of Neolithic people was not massive enough to cause huge amounts of deforestation, it was the start of the decline in Irish forestry. Now, in saying this, the Neolithic people also gave us a lot to go off when it comes to their appreciation for nature. Most of the major tombs and ancient monuments you can think of were created by the Neolithic people. Places like Newgrange show not only an incredible intelligence about nature, knowing exactly where the sun is going to be and being able to chart its movements, but in doing so, a massive appreciation for nature. Even though they had a little bit more control over the wild world around them, they still knew that they were completely subservient to nature and to forestry. This might be a completely subjective opinion, but the Neolithic rock art that we see around the country, I can only associate with nature. The spirals almost remind me of the cross-section of a tree or the way that water flows around a rock, and all the shapes that we see in these rock art are derived from nature. So not only was it something that they depended on and looked at as a source of food, fuel and shelter, but also it was something a bit more than that. While these people were the first people to come along and try and control the wilds and bring it into their domain, they still had this kind of otherworldly appreciation for it. And because of that, we can infer that they would do a little bit more to protect these areas than we are currently. With agriculture and the development of more settled populations, a culture that can be described as Celtic began to form. The Bronze Age brought with it the arrival of metalworking technology, and farming became ever more industrialized with the use of more efficient and specialized tools. This would have brought with it a continued deforestation, and forest levels began to dwindle a little bit more and more. But as we come into the Iron Age, we start to see a change happen on the continent. The Roman Empire begins to build. Because of Ireland's wild reputation and its separation from the continent by the Irish Sea, the Romans never made it to Ireland, and because of that, Ireland was largely saved from a lot of the deforestation that happened on the continent at this time. And it's not like this was a little-known fact. The early bardic word, or one of the early bardic words for Ireland, was Inishnavini, meaning the woody island. In this time of around the first half of the millennium, Celtic society really came into itself. Settlements expanded and became more permanent, and customs and traditions began to cement themselves. Forests at this time still held incredible spiritual significance, which we can see in folk tales and the Druidic tradition, but also had practical significance, being the basis of the early Irish alphabet. I know I've kind of skipped over the Bronze Age and the Iron Age largely, but in all honesty, when it comes to forestry, not a huge amount changed. There was still an ever-decreasing level of forestry as it was used for the large constructions of different religious sites or protection sites, And while woodlands were still revered and looked at as important places, their numbers were still dwindling. And really, it was around 400 AD when Christianity began its spread into Ireland that a completely different view of the wilderness, including woodlands, began to infiltrate the island. While the church did establish monasteries and early Christian settlements with sacred groves and certain trees that were protected, this was a blend of kind of pre-Christian reverence and Christian symbolism with the pagan traditions of the island. A lot of the kind of time-honoured attitudes of reverence for the woodlands and nature in general began to separate out as this kind of distinction between the spiritual and the material came in. The idea that human beings own the earth and have dominion over it comes directly from Judeo-Christian traditions. And so when we look back at this period, from about 500 BC and the beginnings of the Iron Age to 1100 AD, Irish woodlands went through a massive transition, transforming from the vast ancient forests of the post-glacial era into more managed landscapes shaped by different cultural, legal and agricultural practices, where early Celtic societies revered these trees for both their practical and spiritual benefits. With the advent of Christianity, sacred groves and early management practices began to form the basis for a later systematic approach to woodland conservation. This separation from the natural world and view that it is ours for the taking set the stage for what I think to be the final nail in the coffin of Ireland's native forests, and that is colonisation. By the time Viking incursions and early English colonisation began, Irish woodlands had already suffered quite a bit of damage. However, these early events, like I said, paved the way for a new profit-driven vision for Ireland. The Viking age of Ireland is said to be between 795 to 1014. And while this isn't a history podcast, so I won't delve too deeply into the raids of Vikings, one thing that we probably all know is about the Viking longship. These relied on a large amount of high-quality timber, and when Vikings began raiding and eventually settling in Ireland, they exploited the available timber resources that were here. Irish oak at the time was revered for its strength and durability, so it was a safe bet that when the Vikings arrived here with missions of expanding their world, they would make the most of the beautiful, tough wood that they had beside them. Viking settlements also began the clearing on a large scale of coastal woodlands. The Vikings were a seafaring people, and so their settlements largely were on the coasts of Ireland, and because of this, long-established coastal woodlands were cut down to create Dublin, Waterford and Limerick. But the main thing about the Viking Age is that it set the standard for years to come. Ireland became a breadbasket for whoever was the roughest and toughest around. Once we were taken over, we were used to expand the colonial prospects of the nation which owned us. And so, like any story about Irish history, we find ourselves with the invasion of Ireland by the British. In May of 1169, Norman soldiers arrived in Ireland for the first part of the Norman invasion. They arrived, surprisingly, under a request from the deposed King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough, who wanted to keep his position as the King of Leinster. After a series of battles and things that I will not get into in this podcast about forestry, it ended up with Henry II, King of England, gaining authority over Dermot's lands. This began the start of an entire systemic change in Ireland, with the enforcement of a feudal system and a transformation within the church. But the conquest didn't end there. Through the next couple hundred years, through multiple attempts, Ireland was brought completely under British control. Irish chieftains did have some minor successes, and by the 14th century, English rule had shrank a good amount to the point where the Tudors decided that something needed to change. If you're Irish, you've heard of the Pale. This was the area of English rule at that time, mainly consisting out of Dublin. But in 1542, with the Crown of Ireland Act, Henry VIII, the King of England, was made King of Ireland. And with that began the large-scale colonisation or plantation of Ireland. The Tudor conquest introduced a dramatic cultural shift. Common land was increasingly privatized, and forests were reimagined as extractable resources rather than sacred or communal spaces. Traditional practices and local knowledge of woodland management were gradually eroded as land became concentrated in the hands of Anglo-Irish planters, and this shift intensified the disconnect between even the native population and their natural heritage. Land was en masse taken from the Irish people and given to Anglo-English landlords, where they would clear forests for their large stately homes, for shipbuilding and other colonial enterprises. And with the creation of laws like Henry VIII's Forest Act of 1543, the systemic exploitation of Irish woodlands really began. Shipping and military needs were the main driver. There was an urgent need for high quality timber, which, like I said, Ireland had plenty of, as this was essential for shipbuilding to support the colonial expansion and military endeavours of people like Drake and Walter Raleigh. Of course, during this time, forest cover began to more rapidly fall and biodiversity was massively impacted. Another aspect of this was the introduction of new non-native animals like fallow deer to increase the aesthetic value of a stately home, or rabbits for food, and even the hedgehog, which has a little bit of an interesting story. It's kind of an aside, but the Irish for hedgehog is grainneog, or the translation of that, a little ugly thing. Now, in all fairness to the hedgehog, when I look at them, I think that they're quite cute. I don't think that they're that ugly at all. But while listening to an episode of the Blind Boy podcast, I heard his theory, which is the Irish people, when they saw hedgehogs, associated them with this Tudor conquest. They were kept in farms as a food source, and so would be seen as this little ugly thing, a marker that the invasion had reached the person. This period of rapid clearance left Ireland with a kind of patchwork of forestry, mostly secondary growth and marginal woodland remains, and this set the stage for later state-led reforestation efforts, which I'll speak about a good bit later. By 1600, just 3 years before Ireland became fully under English law, forestry cover had fallen to a very, very low 12.5%, down massively from the 80% at the start of the millennium. Even at this time, this was seen as a problem, and from the mid-18th century onward, many large landowners, especially those on estates, were encouraged to improve their lands by planting trees, and did so hoping to kind of exploit these in the future. This kind of started the modern view of forestry, something that could be planted as an investment for monetary gain rather than biological gain. And getting into the kind of mid-1800s, about 140,000 hectares had been planted. But what's interesting is that conifers represented about 80% of this, and the process of coniferization of woodlands really and truly began in Ireland. But this problem would reach its peak in the early 20th century with the arrival of Ireland's independence. Even with the so-called replanting schemes of the 18 and 1700s, Ireland in its independence found itself with less than 1% forest cover, an incredibly low amount, and something that when we look back at now, we think to ourselves, by God, we've brought it up by a lot. But as we'll discuss in this section, just because we have a higher amount of forestry doesn't mean we have better quality forestry. As early as 1907, with the Irish Forestry Commission, efforts were underway to afforest the country and bring back our natural forests. But it wasn't until 1988 with the Forestry Act that we really saw a kind of marked effort in bringing back forestry. Following that, in 1989, Coillte was founded and maybe the death of Irish forestry began. Ireland was a rapidly expanding country. Its population was getting bigger and more centralised into urban centres, and the country felt itself modernising as it joined the EU. One of the ways in which money was coming into the country was through the export of timber and timber products. And to carry this on and to create an industry out of this, Coillte was formed in 1989, and with it became the state-owned forests that we see across hillsides and marginal land now. These are the Sitka spruce plantations I mentioned at the start of this podcast, the unnatural, non-native, quote-unquote, forests. Up until the last sort of 10 years, these were looked on as a good thing, an investment into the land that would bring both biodiversity, even if that wasn't really a term at the time, and also a monetary gain when the trees were clear felled. And even now that we find ourselves at 11% forestry cover, our native forestry is still at between 1 and 2%. So if we look at that, we really haven't increased our forestry at all. We've increased our timber factories, of course, but we haven't increased our actual forest cover. In the early days of the Irish state, these Sitka spruce plantations were mainly seen as a way to reduce our dependency on imports. They were a way to kind of softly patch up an issue while we establish ourselves as a nation. But now all they are is commercial factories. It's well enough time that we move away from this model, but with the recent closure of Cuilcha Nature, the biodiversity focused side of Cuilcha, it feels like we're going the wrong way instead of the right. That coniferization of Irish woodlands that began in the kind of mid-1800s seems to have really taken a hold, and for some people, these Sitka spruce plantations are forests, even though there's nothing about them that represents what an Irish forest should be. In the newly independent Ireland, forestry evolved from a desperate reforestation campaign aimed just at economic necessity, building up the country and making itself more sustainable in a big, big world. But it has evolved into a sector where environmental sustainability and the kind of natural beauty of a forest are a complete side to the economic interest of the companies that are involved in it. And that brings us to our last section, the current state of Irish forestry. As I mentioned, Ireland is around 11% forestry, which makes us among the lowest in Europe for forest cover, and we are 168th globally in forest cover. But forest cover doesn't mean much when those forests are completely meaningless. Our native forestry cover is only 1 or 2% if you want to go with the kind of more hopeful guess, and the other 10% is just the Sitka spruce, or something that gives absolutely nothing of ecological value. As I mentioned at the start, you know yourself the difference between walking through one of these Cuilcha forestry factories and a beautiful native forest. It's within you. You are well aware of it. The hope is that we begin the kind of afforestation in a proper way by helping out the areas of native forestry we already have and allowing them to expand. But in a way, it already feels like it's too little too late as we look at what are supposed to be poster children for beautiful forests. Places like Killarney that are absolutely destroyed from an ecology point of view. Of course, these places can be saved, but when our finest example of forestry on the country is already in a bad state, it doesn't look too good. I don't want to end this episode feeling very disheartened or negative. There is, of course, hope. There's places like I mentioned, Owen Dalton's Wild Atlantic Rainforest. There's some larger scale rewilding projects going on, the likes of Wild Neffin out in Mayo. I just hope that these places are enough at this point. Forestry has such a huge cultural impact in Ireland. It's something that we pride ourselves on. The Emerald Isle, this beautiful rock on the edge of the Atlantic, and I just hope that for future generations there's a little bit more forestry there to be proud of. I also put up on my Instagram story last week asking for questions about Irish forestry that I could answer in the podcast. So I've picked my favourite 2, and just quickly at the end of this episode I'm just going to go over them. So the first question here: when did it become part of Irish folklore that the Fae inhabited woodlands or specific trees? Now, obviously this is quite a hard answer to give because we don't really know specifically when, but as discussed in the episode, it's very clear that from the very first time that humans set foot on the island, that the forests were magical. Now, when did the stories of the Fae come into it? I don't quite know, but when we look at the Neolithic monuments that I was speaking about, it's hard to deny that they knew that there was magic in the forests. For me, if I kind of take off my goggles of a new modern human and I go into a forest with the intention of feeling like I'm back in that period of time, it's very easy to see how someone could imagine the magic in there or feel the real magic in there. When light dapples off water onto leaves, it can look like something is flying past you very quickly. However, aside from my imaginings in the forest, I think it's clear that Fae and fairies have always been a part of the kind of Irish cultural history. Whether they went through that name or whether they went through another, we always knew that something magic lived in those forests. And the second question: how did Irish forests vary based on topography and climate? Well, if we go back to that kind of post-glacial period, the main trees that were here were all pioneer species. These are species that first come into land and create the environment that is necessary for larger species like ash, oak, and other larger trees that get a bit more established. So very early on with our colder climate, we would have had mainly your willows and birch and juniper, things that are a bit more hardy. And as the climate warmed up, we would have gotten the more biodiverse species that we're used to that would have looked quite like a modern ancient woodland. As far as topography goes, this would have had a pretty major impact. Not as major as some other places, as Ireland's mountains aren't exactly Mount Everest, but it would have still had a pretty big impact. It's often said that before humans, a squirrel could have went from one side of the island to the other without having to touch the floor because the tree canopy was everywhere. And that's not quite true. And a lot of that was to do with topography. The rocky hillsides and high up spots of Ireland wouldn't have had the thick forestry that we imagine. They would have mostly been scrubby or even peatlands like we see today. But like I said, Ireland doesn't have these huge mountains like you see in the Alps or in the Rockies. So while topography definitely had an impact on the type of trees and the density, it wouldn't have been a huge factor in early Irish forestry especially. Now we can see that most kind of upland areas where the soil is a bit more marginal and what would have been scrubbier, more sparse forestry cover is now prime for Sitka spruce plantations. These trees will kind of grow anywhere, but it's not a perfect solution whatsoever. We've already talked at length in this episode about the ecological value or lack thereof of Sitka spruce, but we've also seen in recent storms that these trees just aren't suited to our climate, especially in that growth pattern, and with strong winds or anything like that, they will just fall down like dominoes. So, I hope that you learned a little bit from this episode. I definitely did, and the research for this was some of the most interesting research that I had to do for an episode. This is an area that, while I'm definitely passionate about, I have a lot more to learn about, and this is a bit more of an overview, and hopefully in the future I can go a bit deeper into each of these topics and we can get a little bit more into the roots of it, excuse the pun. So thank you very much for listening. This is one of the longer solo episodes I've ever recorded, so hopefully you've made it all the way through comfortably. And with the beautiful weather that we're having lately, I think it's more important than ever that you try and get outside today.